In my last conversation with Len Caston, we covered some of the political and military times of the 1960s surrounding a secret mission to send human beings to a distant planet as part of an exchange program. In this talk, Len discusses the mission itself and what the exchange was about. They gave us technology. I don't know what we gave them, but we will find out. Let's talk about the setting up of the people to go to it. We talked about it a little bit last time. Now, December 1963, Los Alamos received a message from the Ebens about their landing on Earth. This was just weeks after Kennedy's death, as I recall. Was it just after or just before Kennedy's death?
No, the exchange program was set up in the 50s.
Yes, but I'm talking about that communication in the 60s that came through.
Yes. Kennedy was briefed on it by the CIA in the early 60s when he took over, and then he approved it. Mm-hmm. Naturally, he wanted a space triumph desperately after Sputnik. Mm-hmm. And it had already asked von Braun when we could send somebody to the moon and do something on the moon. And Lyndon Johnson was brought in on it because Kennedy had made him the space counsel.
After Kennedy's death, he was brought in, right?
No, Kennedy had appointed him as head of the space council.
But he didn't know about the project.
He did not know about the project.
Right. Okay, so there we are. And now, April 24th, 1964, 2 craft landed near Sirocco. Let's start there. What happened after that?
No, the first craft, they sent 2 craft into our atmosphere, April 24th, 1964. Mm-hmm. One of them, the first one went to the wrong place. It landed outside of Corona. Was it Corona? I believe it was Corona, New Mexico. It was about 100 miles away.
Right.
From where we
slightly off target, yeah.
And do you know anything about the Lonnie Zamora case?
No.
Do you know that a New Mexico policeman was called on an emergency call because an alien craft had landed near Corona, New Mexico? His name was Patrolman Lonnie Zamora.
It's coming back. I've read bits about it. Yes, go ahead.
And the date was April 24th, 1964.
Okay.
That was the alien craft that missed the landing place. And what he encountered was 2 aliens standing outside the craft, which he said was egg-shaped and very large.
Yeah.
And then when they saw him, they scrambled, got back in, and took off. That was the one that was supposed to have landed at Holloman Air Force Base and missed it. But then we sent a message to that craft. They eventually found the right place. But see how that Zamora incident ties in with Serpo.
Yes. Okay. So once the contact was made, now this is 1964. Tell us about some of the prep and how they were kind of managing the logistics for this operation.
Oh, in terms of training the...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, they put an ad in many military journals asking for volunteers. Didn't tell them anything about it, just that it was a dangerous mission, and they got 600 replies, and they eventually narrowed it down to 16.
And these guys...
Some of them, there were 2 women in the original cut.
But not in the final 12. There was some misunderstanding about that. Okay, and now they were taken to the hospitable quarters of Fort Leavenworth prison, right?
The security was so fanatical and so compartmentalized that the DIA didn't want to risk, who was in charge of the program, did not want to risk any possibility of it leaking out, to the point where they didn't want people with families, they didn't want people with children, they didn't want people they wanted them to be orphans themselves. And these men were going to be gone for 10 years, don't forget, so they were concerned. And so they selected them very carefully. A guy from MI6 in England was part of this program. He sent in a letter to the website saying that they had trouble filling all the 12 positions with the right categories, physicians, scientists. They had to actually go out and recruit a couple of them. They couldn't find them all within the military community. They did have to go out and recruit some of them.
So they have their final 16, and how were they trained? How does one train for going into outer space and then living on a foreign planet that really we have no knowledge of?
Well, we already had NASA at that point. They were supposedly in charge of anything to do with outer space, but they were not involved in this program at all.
Right.
They did get involved in the training.
Yeah.
These men were not trained as astronauts.
So let's talk about what their actual training was like.
They were given, the subject matter was very wide. everything you can think of, astronomy, everything that they thought they might need to know was covered. And many of the people that trained them did come forward later and send in anonymous submissions to the website. And that really helped to flesh out the information on the Serpo website. But they were sent to Fort Peary, Virginia, which was the CIA training facility, commonly known as the Farm. In any case, they had their own facility within the Farm, and so they were in a separate, even more secure location, and that's where they were trained mainly. But they were also sent to foreign countries for training, Chile, Mexico, and they were sent to Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida for the high altitude training. So they got a very wide kind of training for this.
But what was the training like for their physical bodies?
We knew they had the right kind of atmosphere. We knew they had carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, just like we do. We knew that already. Don't forget, we had been dealing with them for 9 years prior to Kennedy's advent. So we knew a lot. We had volumes of information about their planet that they'd already given us. They did send the 4 aliens with the craft to help us develop, back engineer the craft. So presumably we knew a lot about them, even though we couldn't communicate fluently with them. First landing in April, as we discussed, April 24th, 1964, they decided they didn't want to take the 12 people with them at that time. We greeted them with a greeting party of 16 officials from the government. I don't believe that President Johnson was among them. The 16 people have not been identified, but they were high officials in military intelligence community, and probably MJ-12. That's my guess, I'm sure. And I think possibly Anonymous was one of them. In any case, they presented us with 2 gifts. One was a automatic translator that we could type into, and we could see their language on it, and they could see our language, and they could communicate that way. They brought those with them. They also presented us with a gift to the people of Earth called the Yellow Book.
Yes.
The Yellow Book was an amazing piece of technology. It wasn't really a book, it looked like a book, but really as you opened it, images sprang out of it, holographic images of what you were looking at, and giving you pictures that were of historical significance going back to 2000 BC.
I loved the description of this. And this particular piece of technology, does it exist today? Does the military still have?
Yes, they have it, of course.
And does it show into the future as well, or only the past?
As far as I know, it just discussed the past. But the remarkable thing about the book was that when you held it close to you, it picked up the language that was in your aura, and communicated with you in that language. And it supposedly had 80 different languages encoded into it. So if you thought in terms of English, you would read English.
That's a beautiful gift.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Okay, so now at what point, 1964, they decided not to take them with them at this time, so then what happened?
They took the 11 bodies of the humans that had died here. There was 6 in the second crash. The Roswell crash was actually a collision between 2 of their craft. They were both identical in terms of the same race. When Reagan was briefed on it, they told him that they were the same exact race from both crashes. One crashed near Datil, New Mexico, and the other one crashed outside of Socorro. And that was the one we recovered. And there were 6 on the one from Datil. There were 4 dead aliens at Socorro and 1 live one. So they took back a total of 11 bodies with them on that landing of April.
And were they stored in the way that Corso mentioned, where they were suspended in some kind of fluid to keep them from degenerating?
Yes. At that time, Los Alamos had developed a cryogenic facility to preserve bodies indefinitely. That was involved with cooling, I guess, supercooling, I'm not sure what. But we had also autopsy, several of them.
So the film Alien Autopsy, the most well-known film called Alien Autopsy?
The Alien Autopsy film was based on the crash that occurred before Roswell. Those aliens were different. They had 6 fingers and toes. They look more human than the Ebens did.
The media has poo-pooed this. It's been...
The autopsy, yes, that autopsy film was the real thing. And I think that the guy that briefed President Reagan said that. He verified that. He validated that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so they've taken their bodies back with them. And what is the plan to return and pick up the
They said they would
humans?
come back in a year.
Mm-hmm. And what happened to this crew? They'd been trained already.
It was an enormous logistics problem for us because we had 40 tons of equipment sitting there waiting to be loaded onto the alien craft, including 3 Jeeps, 10 motorcycles, an incredible amount of stuff. And all that had to be warehoused now. And 12 Americans were sitting in a bus waiting. And they were told they had to go back to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which was a prison.
Right.
And wait there so they wouldn't be able to contact anybody. And we treated them like prisoners, basically.
The ships finally did come. And let's
Yes,
talk about the ships, what happened when they landed, the crew, and then just going on board, kind of getting comfortable.
Right, and what was amazing about that, when the ship finally arrived in July, I think it was 16th of 1965, this one landed at the Nevada test site, not at Holloman. The first one was at Holloman. It was actually on the border of Holloman and White Sands Brewing Ground.
Okay.
The second one came directly to the Nevada test site, which is right near Area 51. They wanted to be near Area 51. At that time, Area 51 did exist. That one landed there, and much like in the movie Close Encounters, the 12 men were taken on board at that point. And what was amazing about that was that the craft was large enough to take the 40 tons. The shuttlecraft that landed was large enough to take the 40 tons of equipment, but they took it all in one move. So evidently they had anti-gravity technology.
Apparently, yeah.
In effect, they were able to, it was all on one platform, all of it.
Yes, that was shocking.
The 10 motorbike.
And all their food and supplies.
Food and everything, yes. All went on in one smooth move.
So their cargo's on board, the people are on board. What was the first experience in terms of the chain of command? Who were the beings that greeted them, and what was that experience like for them?
Yes, well, of course, they still couldn't communicate language-wise, but they did have somebody designated as a communicator.
A female, right?
A female, they call EV number 2. She spoke English pretty well. Evidently, her vocal cords were okay to speak the language. We found out they had certain people on Serpo that could also speak English, but they were mainly mainly doctors and people who were in the educated bracket.
And this female really was to remain their very close ally and companion, more than just a translator. It seemed the way she was depicted was she was quite compassionate and open with them.
The commander was very taken with her. He was very pleased that she was so compassionate and so caring. She was like a combination hostess, translator, guide, all those things wrapped into one. And she was the one that had translated that portion of the Yellow Book to English. She was the one that did that.
So Eben 2.
Eben number 2. And the 12 men got on board the shuttlecraft. And they were taken in, they were put in bubbles. Well, that portion of the trip, they weren't in the bubbles yet. They were taken to the mothership in the shuttlecraft, which was very large in itself, by the way. And that was the one that had landed at the Zamora incident.
Okay.
And if you look at paintings of that incident, that craft doesn't appear to be especially large, but it was large enough to take the 40 tons of equipment with it. And but when they got to the mothership, they were astounded because the commander said in his diary that he was standing in a room with a ceiling that was about 100 feet high. It was huge.
Yeah.
The mothership was huge.
And so they were told from the beginning that they had access to wander the ship to go where they...
Not at that point.
That was later?
Initially, they were put in individual little...
Yeah, the little pods. Bubbles,
yes, yes. That were attached to the floor, to electronics in the floor, so they could be monitored. And if they stepped outside of those bubbles, they got sick.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get to. Also, they were saying that the sound of the Eben's voice would make some of them nauseous and even dizzy.
Yeah, the
tones that were coming out of them.
Yeah, there was screeching, like screeching sounds. It's very weird. And it sounded like high-pitched singing, what the commander said in his diary. And so they were kept in those bubbles during the takeoff, and if they went outside of it, they did get sick. For the whole first half of the journey, they were mainly in those bubbles. And they lost all track of time. They didn't have their backpacks with them. All their equipment was in another part of the ship. The commander was frustrated by the fact that he couldn't get to those backpacks, and he wanted to look at them. But they had to just do with what they had.
And they were given food that was from the Ebens as well, not just their own food. They did run out at one point, right? This was a 10-month journey.
No, the sea rations...
Did they last the whole time?
They lasted the whole time.
But they were eating Eben food, too.
But they were trying to eat the Eben food. They said it tasted like paper. Yeah.
But it also had an effect of, seemed like a healing effect when things started going wrong in their body. Some of these foods started balancing them out again, whatever they were.
Well, no, what healed and helped them with the illness was one of the Ebens would pass a blue
I remember that, yeah.
blue light over them, and they got much better after.
Yeah, light technology.
Yeah.
And now these guys were traveling for 10 months, 39 light years away, which would have been, as I think you said, 40 times the speed of light.
That's right.
So the implication there is they were transiting through what we would call wormholes. So there was a time-space effect going on here.
Yes. They found out later they also had antimatter technology, but the antimatter technology was not what they used to travel through the wormholes.
Okay.
They traveled through a wormhole is instantaneous. It would have to be for them to have covered that vast
collapse the time to that extent, yeah.
10 months. Once they got to the midway point, when one of the Ebens told them they were at the halfway point, they allowed them to walk around the ship freely and ask questions, do anything they wanted to do.
Once you're acclimated.
Yeah. And I think the only times they really got sick is when they were going through the wormholes.
That's what I was just going to ask next. The team commander wrote, "We will all feel better when the craft gets out of this time wave," is how they understood it.
Even then it was a time wave, yes. Yeah.
And then they would go, whenever they needed to, back into these bowls of protection. But then time, the whole notion of time. Now, he was there to chronicle their travels, but he began, you could see in the diary, he said, I don't know when the last time I wrote was. They were all beginning to lose track of time, because it was time passing at this point very differently for them then?
Yeah, subjectively speaking, I think he was not experiencing time the way we would experience time. And he looked at his watch, and it said so-and-so, and he thought, well, maybe one day has passed. But he didn't know. It might have been 3 days.
Well, this apparently was part of the problem in the timing of the mission. They ended up overstaying their original plan by a few years because I guess they lost track of time.
They lost track of time. They brought with them timepieces on batteries, and the batteries ran out. They tried coordinating with the Eben orbit of 43 days around their sun, whereas ours was 43 hours, whereas we were on a 24-hour.
Yeah.
They had to make those computations. It got complicated, and
just hell with it. I think it was a day or two ago.
Just use even time.
Yeah.
Just use even time. That's what they decided to do.
Yeah, which is interesting. We don't stop and think about, obviously they didn't either. They didn't know what to expect. Okay, so one of them was in the engine room. Let's talk about what the engine room was described as on the craft.
Well, they saw these pipes leading to a central location, and they saw like an energy source coming down to that central location, and they realized that there was no sound, so whatever it was energetic. They didn't understand how it worked, okay? But they did know they also were using antimatter. And Bob Lazar did mention that. Have you talked to Bob Lazar?
No, I have not.
He mentioned that the aliens had an element called element 115.
Yes.
which is not
Heavier than our yeah.
not native to our
Yeah,
planet.
yeah.
And that's what they used for the antimatter part of it. So they did use that also. So I think Lazar was validated when it comes to that.
This is where it gets kind of sticky, is one of the team members died
Yes.
on the journey. I mean, it was a bit of an incident.
It was an incident. You know, they were all given 3-digit numbers as new identities.
Yes.
This one was number 308 was his identity. He was actually one of the pilots. They had 2 pilots, a commander, an assistant commander, 2 scientists, 2 doctors, etc. They had it all worked out. This one was the pilot, number 308. Supposedly, the commander discovered that he was dead only because his bubble was unoccupied when he walked around. He didn't see anybody in there. He said he only counted 11 people. And finally, they told him that he had died. Turned out to be a pulmonary embolism. And so 308 was dead, but where was the body? He wasn't told where the body was, and he didn't inquire further at that point because he assumed that the body was in a temporary location.
The holding area
And
somewhere.
it would be turned over to them when they got to Serpo, but that never happened.
Well, they found out the body had actually been autopsied and closely examined.
After a while, the commander asked again when they got there, where is 308's body? The commander said it doesn't exist anymore. I mean, even said it doesn't exist anymore. He said, we were honored to have it to use for our experiments, and we have used it to clone another type of creature that's part alien, part human.
So that would bring me to, kind of a segue question about the Ebens themselves. What was were they cloning their own species as part of the population? And also, what was their process of reproduction?
Our people did snoop around. They were asked not to, but they did snoop around and to find out how they reproduced. They looked in on some of the huts that they lived in and said that it was very much like ours. Mm-hmm. But it was, kind of different too.
Let's talk about how they lived, because I think most people want to know what, they want to have a glimpse of a life from another planet. So let's talk about food supplies. Let's talk about what the environment was like. They had 2 suns, for example. So
2 suns in the sky, so it never got dark.
Mm-hmm.
They had a twilight. The Americans had a difficult time getting used to that.
Yes.
The fact that it never got dark, and they had to they had to plan their days accordingly to have 8 or 9 hours of rest, even though it was light outside, and they worked that out. I think the planet revolved around one of the suns, the larger one. The other one was off in the distance, and it was there all the time. So that was why it was never
right. And when you go to twilight, it was depending on the rotation of the other sun. Yeah.
Right.
Around the other sun.
And it's been debatable whether or not the 2 suns actually revolved around.
We're kind of in a binary.
But my understanding was they were not.
They were not. Okay.
They were not.
So what was the landscape like? What were the temperatures like, and so forth?
Well, when the doors opened and they walked out onto the planet, the first reaction of the commander was, "God, what a planet!" It was just like he said, New Mexico or Arizona, sparse desert dirt, what it was basically, and the heat was overwhelming. It was about 100. I think they figured it was about 140 degrees, something like that.
How did these guys contend with
They
it?
took them into an underground place that was cooler, and that's where they stayed.
Mm-hmm.
That's where they put all the equipment under the ground, and so they could tolerate it that way.
And was it always that temperature then? That was the constant?
That was the equatorial region, yes.
Now, that wasn't the only region. There was another region on the planet. Let's talk about
But
the
the
north.
Ebens preferred that climate.
The warm
They
one.
preferred to live on the yes, they liked the heat.
Okay, let's talk about the other environment.
Well, after a while, when they started to explore the planet, they found that the northern quadrant was very, very reasonably, the temperatures were fine. They were much better.
Trees.
Trees,
Verdant.
water, mountains. They said it looked like Montana, and they named it Little Montana. Little Montana. And they loved it up there. People loved it up there. But they lived in the hot portion of the planet for about 6 or 7 years. Eventually they said, why can't we just live up there? And they said, fine, we'll build you a community, and they did. They built the community especially for our people.
Now, were all of these plants and trees and such native to that planet?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't like they brought those back with body parts and were creating something. Okay.
No, they're like fir trees.
Yeah, exactly.
I put a photo in the book
you
of the Montana climate.
Yes.
And they said that it looked pretty much like that. Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about some of the animals they encountered.
Yeah, they encountered some strange-looking animals. One looked like a lion, but it had a lot of fur around its face. And there was something that looked like an armadillo. And that turned out to be dangerous, the armadillo. But they were instructed not to try and kill them. By the way, they had brought guns with them.
Of course.
Revolvers and rifles both. They were told not to. And
Don't kill any of our species,
right. But they wanted, the Americans did want some source of meat, which they weren't getting.
Because they're vegetarian.
Yeah. And the Ebens did not have any concept of killing animals to eat them at all. So they encountered a creature that looked like a snake.
Right.
But it had very unusual eyes. And they did kill the snake. They did kill it. And they dissected the eyes, and the eyes, they said, were almost like human eyes.
Yes, that was freaky reading about that.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And, but they were allowed to explore the entire planet.
And so they were allowed to eat the snake meat?
Yeah, on that particular occasion, but they told them not to do it again. They said, don't do it again.
Yeah.
We don't like you to do that.
Yeah.
Please don't do it again.
And so let's talk a little bit about the food supplies that they did encounter there.
They grew food, as we would call it, hydroponically, in a very artificial environment where they had soil and they had water. And I think at that time, I don't think we had hydroponics on this planet. I'm not sure that we did.
In the 60s, that would have been a bit early.
Yeah.
We did by the 70s, but...
Yeah, well, maybe some of that came from them.
Maybe.
A lot of technology did come from that trip. And maybe we learned about hydroponics from them. They had to wear, when they went into the hydroponics facility, the person in charge told them not to come in because they weren't wearing anything on their head. She got EB number 2, who said that you have to wear something on your head. And she went and got them hats to wear while they went through that particular facility. But, so they grew the food that way.
A lot of it was, again, tasteless to the Americans, although some of the fruits, it sounded like, were pretty decent and sweet.
Yes, exactly. The fruit was the closest thing that we could come with. The rest of it, they said,
paper.
Tasted like paper.
But again, they said some of those foods, those bland foods, were used in healing them when they weren't feeling well, when they're nauseous and all.
They did say that, yeah.
Yes.
They did say that. So the foods were nourishing. And, of course, the Ebens could get all they wanted. They didn't have to buy anything. There was no money.
No money in the culture. I think a lot of people would,
no concept of money.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good one.
Right.
Causes a lot of suffering.
Yeah, exactly. They had a central facility where the Ebens could go and take anything they wanted. They needed.
And they continued using the light for healing purposes and such. Light was really primary to what they did.
Yeah, they did. Exactly. And
using frequencies.
We tried to teach them our science. They weren't terribly interested in it. They took a radio telephone apart to show them how it worked, and they were surprised that it was so different from what they knew. When they put them in their quarters, when they arrived, they had light and they had power. And our people were able to plug anything we had into their boxes, and it worked.
Yeah.
It all worked. We found out later why that was the case, because what they called the crystal rectangle was taken back to Earth and analyzed. But anyway...
What did we find out from the crystal rectangle?
We found out that there was like a small little bubble of antimatter that reacted to any demand put on it.
How are we using that now?
50 volts, it got 50 volts. If it needed 10 volts, it got 10 volts.
Perfect. How are we using it? Do we know? I mean, it's obviously being used probably in some exotic military technology, or...
If we have that technology, just think of all of the things that would revolutionize.
Well, don't we?
We must. We must have it.
And so, yeah, I think that's the holy grail.
He shared everything with us freely.
So, any final thoughts? We're out of time.
I think that the Serpo story opens a door that, if we could truly admit to it, would be tremendous in terms of opening the whole story. Because it was put with the DIA and not the CIA, it's a hole into the ability, into this information that we need to really get into, and perhaps this will start it. Hopefully.
Well, I wish you the best of luck in your Freedom of Information Act journey. That should be fun.
I'm not optimistic.
Yeah, you might feel beaten up by the end of that one. But thank you for what you've already done. It was just absolutely enthralling.
It's been fun. I'm glad we would do this.
There's so much more to the story. You can find out about it in the book Secret Journey to Planet Serpo. Until next time, thank you for joining us here on Gaiam TV.
Of spirituality.